Last week, we learned how to fill out truth tables for formulas that had two propositional variables. So to start out with this week, I'd like to talk about how to generalize that procedure, how to create truth tables for formulas with any number of propositional variables. So let's begin by looking at truth tables that have just one propositional variables. So let's go ahead and fill in a truth table for this formula. If P, then not P. This formula has only one propositional variable, namely P. So here's what the truth table for this one looks like. I have only one propositional variable, namely P. There are two possible truth values for that one propositional variable, namely true or false. Okay, so that gives me all the possible truth values for P. Now I want to go ahead and fill in the truth table itself. So I'll go ahead and just copy those truth values down for the antecedent of the conditional here that I'm filling out the truth table for. So that's true and false. Now I look at the column where the consequent is. Consequent of this conditional is not P. Not P, of course, is just P with a negation sign in front of it. And negation signs flip truth values. So since the truth values for P are true and then false, the truth values for not P are false and then true. Now this is a material conditional. The one case in which a material conditional is false is when its antecedent is true, but its consequent is false. That case occurs in the top row here. Here is the one and only case where it is false, and in the other case here is true. So this is the truth table for if P, then not P. And since this formula had only one propositional variable, its truth table required only two rows for truth values. We've already seen what truth tables with two propositional variables look like. They require 4 rows for truth values. In general, if n is the number of propositional variables in one's truth table, the number of rows for truth values required is 2 to the n. So truth tables with one propositional variable require 2 to the 1 rows, namely 2 multiplied once, so just 2 rows. Truth tables with two propositional variables require 2 to the 2 rows, that is 2 multiplied 2 times, so 2 times 2, which is 4 rows. Truth tables with 3 propositional variables require 2 multiplied 3 times, that is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8 rows, and so on. So let's look at an example with 3 propositional variables. So consider this formula. If P, then R or Q. I'm going to go ahead and set up this truth table as follows. Note that at the very top there I have arranged the propositional variables not in the order that they occur in the formula, but in alphabetical order. Remember, our convention is to always arrange them in alphabetical order. So the order here is P, Q, R, even though that's not quite the order in which they occur in the formula. Now I have 3 propositional variables here, so I require 2 to the 3 rows. That's 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8 rows. So I've set up 8 rows for truth values here. And I've gone ahead and filled in the truth values for the P column. What I've done is I've taken my 8 rows and divided them in half, and devoted the first half of those rows to trues and the second half of those rows to falses for P. So 4 rows devoted to trues for P, 4 rows devoted to falses for P. Okay, now I'm going to move on and focus on the Q column. And here's how I'm going to fill in the Q column. I'm going to take the 4 true rows for P, and I'm going to cut them in half and devote the first half of those rows to trues for Q. So there are 4 true rows for P. I cut those in half. That gives me 2 true rows, I devote those first 2 true rows to trues for Q. And then I devote the other half of those 2 true rows for P to falses for Q. So for Q I get true, true, false, false here at the top. And then I repeat that very same pattern below. So true, true, false, false. Okay, now that I've done that for Q, I move on to R. R is the last column for filling in possible truth values for propositional variables in my truth table. The last column, the last propositional variable, always involves alternating between true and false. That is, it always goes true, false, true, false, true, false, and so on until one reaches the bottom row. So the last column, the last column for the last propositional variable will always look like that: true, false, true, false, true, false, and so on. Okay, now it's time to go ahead and start filling in the truth table for the formula. So I'll focus on, so we have this conditional, the main sentential connective is an arrow. I'll go ahead and focus on the sub-sentence to the left of the main sentential connective, which is P. I'm going to go ahead and just copy down the column of truth values for P, so that's 4 trues and 4 falses. Now I focus on the sub-sentence to the right of the main sentential connective, R or Q. I'll go ahead and just copy down the column for R, which is alternating. R, remember, if you look to the left, R just alternates between true and false. So true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false for R. Now I'll focus in on Q. I'll copy down its truth column, which I also see over there to the left. It goes true, true, false, false, true, true, false, false. So I just write that down over here. Okay, so now I figure out what to write down as the truth value for the truth values for the whole disjunction. Well, remember that a disjunction is false in only one kind of case, namely when both of its disjuncts are false. And I see by examining this truth table that that kind of case occurs twice. It occurs here and here. These are the only rows on the truth table where both R and Q are false. So these are the only rows in which the disjunction R or Q is false. It is true everywhere else. Okay, so now I have the truth values for my disjunction. I'll go ahead and cross out these other columns because they're no longer relevant. And I'll focus on evaluating the truth values for this whole conditional. This is a material conditional. It is false in only one kind of case, namely when it has a true antecedent and a false consequent. If I look at the truth table here, I see that occurs in only one case on this truth table, namely here. So this conditional is true everywhere else. And I'll go ahead and cross out all the other irrelevant columns, and that gives me the truth table for this conditional. Okay, let's move on. Let's go ahead and try setting up this truth table. And I'm not going to fill in the whole truth table, but I am going to show you how to set it up. This formula has 4 propositional variables: P, Q, S, and R. So since it has 4 propositional variables, it requires 2 to the 4 rows for truth values. That is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, which is 16. So this truth table requires 16 rows. You can see that these truth tables quickly become quite massive the more propositional variables that one adds. So let's go ahead and get started on setting this up. So I have my 16 rows here. I've already filled in the column for P. Note once again that I've arranged the propositional variables up at the top in alphabetical order, P, Q, R, S. Now, having filled in the column for P, what I've done is I've taken my 16 rows, divided them in half. devoted the first half of those rows, that is the first 8 of those rows, to trues for P, and the second half, the latter 8 of those rows, to falses for P. Okay, now I get to work on filling in Q. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the true rows for P, and I'm going to devote half of those to true rows for Q. So that gives me 4 true rows for Q. And then I'm going to fill in the other half of those true rows for P with falses for Q. And then I'm going to just repeat that very same pattern below. So 4 trues and 4 falses below. Okay, now moving on to R. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first 4 true rows for Q, and I'm going to cut those true rows in half and devote half of them to true rows for R. So there's 4 true rows up there. I'm going to cut them in half, devote the first half of them, namely the first 2 of them, to true rows for R. And then I'm going to go ahead and let the other half of those true rows for Q be false rows for R. So that gives me true, true, false, false for R up top. And I'm just going to repeat that pattern once again below, and then once again, and then once again, until I've filled in all of the rows for R. Okay, this brings me to S. S is the last of my propositional variables, and as I said before, the last column for one's propositional variables just goes true, false, and so on all the way down. So I'll go ahead and fill in that pattern for S. Okay, study this pattern closely. It's important that you have a grasp of how this pattern works. So if you didn't quite see how this pattern works, pause the video, examine it, rewind it, see how it is that I'm filling in this truth table. As I said, I'm not going to go ahead and fill out all of this truth table. I just wanted to show you how to get started, how to set it up. So that completes this lecture.